in Social Justice, which was an awesome course. And one of my favorite aspects about that course in particular was his teaching style. And he would record these videos for each weekly lesson, and then we would have conversations. And he encouraged us to make our own videos or to write a response or something like that. But he broke the monotony of that weekly sort of, read response, write response, make statements and that sort of thing. So it was really fantastic. But what I really appreciated about Dr. Horsty just was his affects in presenting the information. Very polished, very professional, and also very heartfelt, which of course is something that resonates with me. And I have to tell you, I modeled my own teaching practice after, not as effectively, but I'm working on it. So I'm really proud to have Dr. Horsty here. And with that said, I'd like to introduce Dr. Christopher Horsty.
Thank you. Okay, good. The nice thing about wearing the beaded medallion is it doubles as a lapel microphone anchor. So if this is a little bit loud, if it's too loud, let me know, and I'll have someone try to turn it down. I usually don't like the microphones. The old ladies in my community have generally said, if you've got something worth saying, you say it and use your voice. But I've also found after 20 years of research conferences that you lose your voice really quick doing that, because for 90 minutes getting up and yelling at people can sometimes be a little rough on the vocal folds. So I want to thank Tom and Jeremy for inviting me out and extending the opportunity. I'm happy to be here on the traditional lands associated with the Caldwell Confederated Tribes. I was a documentary filmmaker for CCT for off and on for 6 or 7 years. I got an opportunity to interview a number of their elders that are now gone. If you still go to their website and look at their digital resources, many of the projects that I got to work on with their very old, very accomplished voices are still there. I'm going to talk a little bit today about decolonizing support, and I'm not one of those guys when you hear decolonizing that I'm going to pound on the table and use like guilt and emotion, and I'm not going to cry, I'm not going to do any of that stuff, because I don't think that's useful. How many people like those kinds of decolonizing presentations? I'll tell you right now, it's usually my relatives that do it, and I sit in the back, and I'm just like, alright, and I'll find a way to leave, because I don't think it's helpful. I don't think it helps us to build bridges to developing future capacities, and so I don't want to do that, because I just don't think it's useful. But I'm going to talk a little bit today about a few of the things that not just myself, but many of my relatives from my community that are military veterans, that are disabled veterans, that are getting their health care either through the Department of Veterans Affairs in the United States or also in the Department of Veterans Affairs in Canada. This is me, this is where we are, and all that good stuff. Primarily, I'm a consultant for the Ktunaxa Nation Council. I've been conducting federally funded competitive research funded through the Canadian Institutes of Health Research, Indigenous Services Canada, the Phillips Fund for Native American Research, and a number of other organizations for about 20 years or so. I'm a little bit dressed down today, first conference back in a couple of years. I didn't know it was good to have like not sweatpants on today, so I figured it was okay if maybe I was a little bit dressed down. I did get my limited edition Jeff Grosso Vans during the pandemic, and I said I would only wear them when I got to either teach in person again or present, so I'm wearing them today, and they went better with this outfit than say Xenia or something like that. This is me, Secretary for the Treasury Board of Canada. I'm a really real researcher. I'm not one of those guys that gets up and is charismatic and talks about Indigenous issues and changes the way that people think based on my ability alone. I've been doing research for a long time. I have a background in applied mathematics, applied economics, later applied linguistics, and then a PhD in leadership theory. Not many people know what that is. It's kind of like half psychology, half group dynamics. And I'm a complexity theorist. I like to know what happens in a system when there's not a set of rules to tell you what should happen in that system. I focus on large-scale data sets, and I want to see what social networks do to generate resilience outcomes when there's not a blueprint for resilience outcomes. I did a TED Talk about myself and my daughter. She'd be super mad if she knew she was in this presentation. I have been invited to present original research at MIT, a number of other top-tier research institutions, and probably my favorite, I was invited to present in person in November 2017 at the Central Intelligence Agency headquarters. So I'm not one of those activists that's going to get up here and say, you should listen to me because I know. I'm one of those people that does data and research, and I'm able to draw from conversational analysis, textual analysis, to look at the kinds of interactions we're having on social networks, online, and in person that many people don't really see. Non-obvious pattern recognition, collective intelligence, and those kinds of areas. But most importantly, I think, I'm not just a cultural person, I am also a healthcare receiver from the Department of Veterans Affairs. This was a knee surgery I had at Mann Grandstaff. Anyone here work at Mann Grandstaff? Oh, there we go, yeah. Good one, no, it's great. I grew up with my first healthcare on this planet being through Indian Health Service. Later, I had Health Canada coverage. I've had private coverage in the States, and I can still tell you to this day the best healthcare I've ever had is with the Department of Veterans Affairs, and I know a lot of people think it's crazy when I say that, but even in the pandemic, going in with my family and getting our vaccinations there, my wife left and said, for as many people that complained about the VA, that was the most professional healthcare. I felt more informed than when I go to my own doctor that I've known for years. So I want to start off by saying that I'm not one of those guys that's going to get up here and tell you everything that you're doing wrong. I think there's a lot of things with VA healthcare that's done very well. And this was just kind of funny because I was getting ready to go under, and my wife asked me, she says, oh, we should get a picture sooner or later, you'll use it in a presentation for something. And I was like, no, I don't think so. And then here we are. So I'll have to tell her that I was able to use that. I'm going to talk a little bit about culture, colonization, and then resilience, because I don't really like decolonization or anti-colonization or post-colonization. I think that there are hegemonic systems that we all struggle with in our lives, and I think that we're constantly motivated by resilience. Reconciliation. We want to find some issue to the problems that we face, and we want to find some way to kind of carry on beyond that. And then I'm going to talk about some specific to veterans in my community, and because we are a different cultural group, there'll be some nice outcomes that I'm able to highlight. I love historic photo analysis, visual data, thematic cartography, so I've got a very graphics-heavy presentation here. But when we talk about culture, and because I am an organizational theorist, I love Edgar Schein's work. He talks about culture being the system of shared values that describes what's acceptable behavior, provides stability by reducing uncertainty around us, found in the world, it organizes our activities, it gives us a coherent narrative. And for my community, we're called Kootenai Indians, but we're really the Ktunaxa Nation. Our coherent narrative has been calibrated for about 13 millennia. The confluence of British Columbia, Alberta, North Idaho, kind of northeastern Washington, and northwestern Montana. So right there, doing anything health related has 2 national considerations, 2 provincial, and 3 state considerations. So doing anything, including getting your rapid PCR test across the border in our community so I could see my father, or he could see me, was a freaking nightmare. I don't have a nicer way to say it. The primary tools there, literally the sounds we make to one another, our language. This is our culture, or all the protocols that we have that integrate our activities. Stories of animals are the people, and this is our Bible. These are our very old teachings. From the beginning of human existence, how we solve problems, and pass those ideas on from one generation to the next. And that all gets wrapped up in what we call this Vietnam, or our way of teaching. And for me, I didn't grow up around my father's community. I thought that, I thought that my father's father was like a native person from a magical Indian tribe in Alabama or something. I grew up in Bellingham, Washington. I did not know his mother or father. And when I was around 16, I was told, hey, I don't know how to tell you this, but your grandfather died. And I kind of laughed and said, no, Grandpa Harold died when I was 7. And my dad says, no, my father. And I didn't really know how to react because I never met him, I never knew him. I didn't really know anything about him or where he lived, and I was, kind of like, oh, angsty 16-year-old punk rocker was like, okay, so where's the funeral? And he says, oh, it was last weekend in Seattle. I was like, why was it in Seattle? And he says, well, he lived on Capitol Hill. If you're from Bellingham, Washington, and you're a teenager, and you're into punk rock music, and you're in bands, and you collect records, then Fallout Records and Orpheus and everything about Capitol Hill is where you spend every weekend. 84 miles, I could drive it in like 55 minutes. Datsun B210, 1967. I just know that because I was telling my daughter who's trying to get a car right now, yeah, you probably won't have a Datsun B210. The thing that's important about that is I likely spent hundreds, if not thousands of hours within a mile or two of my biological grandfather. I never met him, didn't know anything about him. Didn't really know his name. I couldn't have picked him out of a lineup. And by the time I got to university, I realized something was really wrong about that. The average human being shouldn't be that separated. The average human problem-solving group, our culture, if you will, our social group, our network, probably shouldn't be that fragmented and disconnected. But it was. And I started my education focusing, I originally wanted to be an architect, hence the mathematics and why I write everything in all capitals, because I was a draftsman. But as soon as I got to the Western Washington University campus, I started focusing on social systems, psychology, abnormal psychology, sociology, those kinds of things to figure out what's going on in our heads, both as individuals and as groups when we kind of aggregate all of our ideas and behaviors together. So if we were to have our video right now, oh, there we go. Okay, another way of thinking about culture. Okay, let's try this because it might hopefully catch and figure it out. Okay, another way to think about culture is that it's a way of taking all the explicit teachings that we get and kind of having them to become implicit knowledge. This boy grew up riding with his grandmother, with 2 or 3 or 4 of his siblings. All of the lessons that he had to know starting off back here. Don't touch the tail, don't grab the ear, don't loosen that, don't do this to the saddle, don't make loud noises. All of those things over time just become a part of who he is, so he can become his own horseman, even at a very young age. So that's an aspect of culture. The way that we work with our young people to make the sturgeon nose canoe, which is something distinct to our community, something that our community has done since the beginning of time. We're one of the 2 cultural groups on the planet that never quit making them. We start from a young age working with our young people to teach them how to make these vessels. And here's proof. Working with some of these kids in a big gymnasium, and we hear them shaping the ribs that give the hull its shape, and one of them breaks, and everyone stops moving as if you're in training and someone drops a rifle and you hear the familiar sound, and then nobody wants to know that it was them. Well, we told the kids, hey, it's all right, our community is real smart. You can go just a few 100 meters in any direction of this building and find everything that we need. You're going to go halfway to Patty Jacobs' house. On the left side of the trail, you're going to find some saplings with these leaves. You're going to find this one that's bigger at the base than 1 inch, but shorter than 2 inches. And you're going to bring us one back. And these kids came back like they had just went hunting for the biggest elk in the world, like a 30-point buck or something. And they super proud because they got to be a part of these things that we didn't do for a long Culture gives us all the tools we need to survive all the challenges around us, to maintain our identity across space and time. If you listen to the book Connected, I like audiobooks. If you look at what they were talking about, they said that any network can maintain its identity if you can generate new nodes that are educated the way that old nodes are, so that there is a redundancy in your network, and when some people get old and pass away, or they're cut off or removed, we have new nodes to move in to their jobs. This was our very last Sundance, which was very important for our veterans. 1947, I believe. We never had another one after this, but that doesn't mean that it went away. So colonization, which I've lectured on quite a lot, to me, is just the forced undoing of culture. All you're doing is you are establishing systems in someone else's place, or you're appropriating kind of ideas, the information in their network, the kinds of data that tell them who they are and what they do. Linda did that indigenous categorization of useful localized knowledge is discovered, extracted, appropriated, and distributed by the colonizer and rerouted from the imperial center, often in the form of Latin. We still have biologists that come to our community and ask elders, we want to name this species of fish in your community. And the old ladies will just get irate and say, we already have a name for that fish. And the name translates to something important about its environment, because we have this 13,000-year history of relating to the land. Well, we're going to do it in English, or we're going to do it in Latin. And they'll say, we all went to the residential school. We know enough Latin to know that it's dead. We never heard Latin again after we left the school, but we still use these names today. And that's a little bit kind of a microcosm of the way this systemic management works. If you can tell other people, if you want to be official or institutional or normal, then you've got to play by our rules. And until you do, you're kind of lexically marked as unofficial or non-institutional or abnormal. You're outside of kind of that general verbiage. Everything for us changed around the 1890s. The men are now gone. The usefulness of men was reduced in our community, and now we have women and children with the priests standing over them. And the women, those kids aren't learning about canoes or riding horses anymore. They are physically in the clutches of their mothers. Some of them are getting stashed away inside of the lodge. Kids aren't running around playing, doing the kinds of things they would have done before. And in our cultural ways, before the age of 5 or 6, your only job is to be happy. You're watching people, you're learning, you're being happy. These kids aren't happy anymore. All of the social systems are different. They have been overwritten by an invasive species. No one sits in a circle and solves problems anymore. We're lined up in a grid at residential schools where there's a wonderful property of the circle, up to 150 or so people. You can make eye contact with everyone. You can hear their voice. You get a general idea based on their body language and their kind of their affect, if they're being honest with you or not. When you're lined up in a grid, each of these boys can see no more than one other person at a time. That support is gone. And of course, this is one of the pictures from the Carlisle schools. Colonel Pratt, Kill the Indian, Save the Child, Kill the Indian, Save the Christian. There's something like 800 kids in this picture, and not one of them is smiling. And you can look through this picture. You can spend hours looking through it. Something horrific is happening here. I have a daughter, and she's got friends, and when you get them together, getting them all to do the same thing is exponentially more difficult based on how many kids are there. Not one of them is smiling, not one is laughing, not one is learning anything here. They're not interacting. So, if colonization is that overriding of those systems, what is decolonization? If you're an activist today, it's talking about how bad capitalism is, and it's talking about how you can't call me what I don't want to be called, and I'm going to make you think differently, and it's about emotion and volume and repetition and pounding on the table and tears and crying. And the people that you need to reach the most in that process are not listening to you. Because I can tell you right now, when people do that to me, even people from my own community, I tune them out. I'm really good about compartmentalizing, and I will start thinking about like power law distributions or something in the back of my head while that's going on. But in working on as much health policy analysis as I have in the last few years as a research fellow for the University of British Columbia, Okanagan, we started to look at what does it really mean? Decolonization is not a metaphor. It's not this thing that you can tell people we're going to do, and then we all think about it, and then poof, it happens. It's not a literary idea that we can talk about, everyone can reflect on, and then we magically know what to do. It's a process. It's historical, and it can be uncomfortable because it unsettles and dismantles parts of organizational culture that have been there for a long time. When you look at the way a healthy indigenous community is working with its veteran people, if you only went to Western medical school and you've been a Western administrator, where a formulary and a budget are in charge of everything that you do, it's non-institutional, it's unofficial, it's abnormal, it's all of those lexically marked things. Because in your head, you know what's institutional, and you know what's normal, and you know what's official. Decolonization is the willingness to cater to the competencies of locality, the ability to shift the locus of enunciation. I'll only interact with you if I get to determine where we enunciate. Meaning you and I, we can say whatever we want, but anything that's outside of what I'm saying, if you think of it as a Venn diagram, right? Everything that's important to me, important to you, and we overlap it, and I tell you, oh, the only place we're going to enunciate or clarify things is in my circle and not yours. That's not that helpful. When we can identify ideas that are in the middle, now we've got a little bit of common ground to stand on. Boundary objects. If you are into library sciences, you might know above and beyond the Dewey Decimal System, the coolest thing that come out of library sciences were boundary objects. Concepts, ideas. Firm enough to let both communities understand what's going on, but flexible enough for us to relate to and have a few differences. If you study communities of practice, when they erect into communities of interest or constellations of practice, they flex through boundary objects. There's something that I can relate to, there's something that you see, there's something that allows me that common ground to step on and feel comfortable having these philosophical negotiations. Preservation of distinction, rejection of the hegemonic processes. Anytime you have a conversation, no matter what it is, right? No matter what it is, it doesn't have to be like this heavy power differential dynamic of colonization. If you go into any conversation by telling people, these are the words that we're going to accept, and these are the ones we're not going to, and these are all your words out here. There's not a lot of common ground there. There's not a lot for us to relate to. It's a little bit difficult for us to see where do I fit in? And if it's your healthcare system and you don't fit in, then many of those strategies and resources and ideas, those influences that can be very positive and supportive, don't fit in. Now, what I'm not saying here, and I want to clarify this, I am not saying that military training should be different for different cultures. I served as a soldier in the United States Army as a 19 Delta. I served my time at Fort Knox, Kentucky, from the day one that you get there and get yelled at on the bus to the speeches that we all bleed green and we're all the same and we wear uniforms, not uniforms, because we're uniform and we're not individuals anymore. Those parts of serving a higher cause mean that you do at times have to take some of those things that are important to you and understand that there is something larger there. There were things I was allowed to bring with me. If you look at my dog tags, it says other under religion. They told me, oh, there's Native American on there. Native American is not on there. At least it wasn't in 2003. But I knew going in, I was going to be a part of a group, a unit, larger than myself, and it meant that I would have to make some sacrifices. But to me, that all changed the day I was diagnosed as a type 2 diabetic. Because if you're a diabetic, you're non-deployable. And if you're combat arms and you're non-deployable, you're non-retainable. You are a lot like pissing in the wind. You are the epitome of the broke dick. So that narrative goes from, well, bleed green, drink water, do push-ups, and drive on to, oh yeah, you're going home. And the VA is going to take care of you when you get home. Well, I got home, and the Montana Veterans Association or Montana State Veterans, whatever. Anyone from that group here? Okay, good, because those guys didn't want anything to do with me. And I got home and they were like, we have absolutely nothing to do with you, and we will never provide any services to you. It's like, okay, can you tell me where the nearest VA hospital is? We're hit. So what happened to me was I got submerged back into my social network, my community. The soldiers from my community that had spent time overseas, that had served their community, that served their country and came back to their community, they reached out and they said, hey, some of the things that you're going to need, you're not going to find them. You're not going to find them at the VA. You're not going to find them at the MEPS center. You're not going to find them at the recruiting office anymore. That's done for you. But there is a society that we have that's here to support you. And it's a very old society related to our Sundance in a very old ways. It's the Kukatsin, or the Crazy Dog Society. These are the people that have had similar experiences as you, and this will be your social network that will help you integrate some of the things you're going through back into the larger context. So visually, because I love the networks, here's a community doing your thing, solving problems like every human problem-solving group on the planet, moving information efficiently, right? It's not a flat network where if you want to move information from this person to this person, it's like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. That's not very effective. What we have now, we have low geodesics and high clustering. So she tells someone from her group that tells someone from this group that jumps through this person, and now 5 links away, that information can be moved effectively. All human problem-solving groups do this. This is colonization. This is just erasing those links. Alvar Lashley would tell you, you kill a network by separating the links and making every individual a non-communicating island. Every single problem now has to be solved by the individual from first principles. There's no one to ask for help. Nobody to tell you what's going on. You're having anxiety? You're shit out of luck. Figure it out on your own. Because children were taught not to trust their parents at the residential schools. And if you are a big believer in sending missionaries to my community, I'll tell you that's a bad plan, and we're not going to get along about that. It's very well, especially in Canada now, it's very well documented that the purpose of the residential schools wasn't to educate our community members, it was to break down the social structure. We were taught not to trust our parents. We were really taught not to trust our grandparents because they were our primary teachers. Horrific stories of my uncle being walked up to the barbed wire fence and the priest saying, there's your uncle, there he is, lying around, not working, no good to anyone, you don't ever want to be. There's your grandfather drinking again, whether he was drinking or not. You do what he does, you're going to go to jail, you're never going to work, you're never going to have a job. This kind of invasive reprogramming of that code. You just cut the ties. Even this little tiny baby here with their mother, that tie would be broken at some point. To the point where you don't even know who your grandfather is when you live 80 miles away. This might as well have been little Chris. No, I was a little bit older, let's say, maybe right here, right? This should have been me and my grandfather, but it didn't happen. I was really lucky that I had a mother and her parents that kind of filled that role. And I was really lucky that when I moved home after college, all of those old people took me on as their grandchild. And they said, hey, we know there's something missing inside of you. And we can't give you everything, and we can never fulfill their role. But we can help kind of recreate that cluster between you and those people, and we can help you with those things. And then you, in turn, get to do that and pass that on to your daughter and to younger people from the community. This is entropy, right? This is now the Indian agent with their dog, who's the most important part of the network, whether they were central or not. And you give them all the power to communicate, and you break all this is just imposing your communicative pathways, your strategies, your information on another group. If you study networks, you know that entropy is just a rise in disorder. Entropy is the work that's lost, not able to be converted into outcomes. It's the disorder that happens because none of these links make sense. If they did make sense, they would look somewhat like the old links that were on here. This, to me, is resilience. You'll notice the original links are on here. Some of the ways that we communicate that are useful, some of the ideas that do work, but you'll notice we've got new strategies that we're writing in here. Here's something we didn't have before, this one. Let's create something there, a new strategy, an idea, a song, a program, a scholarship. There are networks that have been studied looking at one of my favorites. If you go to EMP in Seattle, they used to have one on the wall. It was all the Northwest Coast bands and who was in different bands with people. And a lot of the people I was in bands with are only 1 or 2 links away from them. People have studied networks of hugs, giving the most physical form of support you can give someone by giving them a hug or a handshake. We're now allowing people to use what has worked in the past, and we're giving them the ability to use new tools, new ideas, incorporate them in. So, this is not me saying all military training needs to change. It needs to be culturally sensitive. That's not what I'm saying. This is not me saying whatever money you get for healthcare for Indigenous veterans, you need to give to someone else that knows them better. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is some things work really well, and some things could work better. I learned this firsthand when I got my first VA doctor, who was a military doctor, who was a formulary guy. My first appointment was scheduled for 15 minutes, which I thought was a little short, but not as short as the actual 5 minutes I got. I've just looked at your labs. We're going to keep everything the same. It says I should be giving you metformin, and I will see you again in a year. Well, I have some questions. I have some concerns about some of the, because I'm that kind of person, I got to research all the medications I'm on. And he was like, well, it says here you were 19 Delta, you guys were pretty tough, so you'll cope with it. We'll see you in a year. That was my first VA doctor. And no matter what I said, we were just going to talk about it in a year. That was, whatever you think works for you isn't working for you. There's a list that tells us what we can or can't give you, and that's what we're going to do. He was only my doctor for a couple months. After that, I've had 3 civilian doctors in a row. The first one that I met at our initial meeting, his stethoscope, which I've been told later is actually a sphygmomanometer, was beaded. And I met him and I was like, oh, where did you? He was like, oh, I did part of my original preceptorship training at the Indian Health Service in Billings, Montana or something. And he set aside an hour to do background, history, consultation, figure out what's going on, go completely through every lab. The next 2 doctors that I had did the same thing. I don't ever want you to come in here, one of them said, I don't want you to come in here and feel like we're rushing you through and kicking you out the door, because that's not helpful, and that isn't really health anymore. That's not really what we do. If we don't need an hour, we don't have to take it, but I want to make sure that if you have questions, we can answer them. I want to get to know a little bit about your family and that history, biological endowment, and genetic considerations, those kinds of things. That, I think, is a little more like this. Sure, there's a system that's coordinated through the VA and it's paid for by a certain way out of a certain fund, and there is a formulary, and what we can or cannot give you is largely determined by that. Some of the details, things we can go through, are a little bit different. Can be a little bit different. So I talked about lexical marking. I like tag clouds. These are just a few of them that I like to use. Formal and informal. Textual and contextual is an interesting one, and Jeremy, if you're in here, Jeremy was a part of generating some of this data. I teach this in all of my doctoral classes, and it's an amazing exercise in thinking about the language that we draw from on it. And when he finally received the findings, he thought completely different about those words. In a conversation, a really difficult conversation, he says, I feel a little bit whole again, because that part of me that I couldn't ever really describe has a little bit of a different form and meaning now. There was a little bit of validation, but also there was a way for me to make a little more sense out of what's happening. For us, we have done a ton of research in our community, and one of the areas, one of those blind spots that we had really forever was genealogy. Everyone should know who their parents and grandparents are. And not just because that gives us the warm fuzzies about being connected in a family, but if you have relatives that are type 2 diabetic, you should probably know that. If there is a history of heart disease in your family, you should know that. If history of skin cancer, you should probably know that. We, in 1995, and then for about 2 years, had a genealogist that showed up in our community that said, doing my master's degree. So first off, she only had a bachelor's, did not have a master's yet. I'm a scientist, I'm a genealogist. I'm going to do some interviews, but you need to understand this data belongs to me and my institution. At the end, we'll tell you some things about your community, but your data will belong to me. And when some of my relatives would look at the family tree and see things that were blatantly incorrect, they would say, turn over all documents related to our community and you will leave and not come back. You are not welcome here. Your research is invasive and it's counter to our notions of community health. Whoa, 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 I'm getting my master's degree. None of that matters, you're done. Pack it up, pack your lodge up, and you get the hell out of here. That's kind of, there's a whole indigenous would bring it up. That anxiety, that frustration, that pain just took over. Well, we built a cultural building called a roundhouse, which is in the style of our large lodges that we would do our Sundances and our other ceremonies in. And one day, I said, we did this nice process for about 5 years where Christopher got to do like 20 workshops. And they were all something like, learn about how our culture teaches you about the world, or learn about how our language organizes, but what they all were was, let's talk about cultural trauma without talking about collective trauma. Because if you put collective or cultural trauma in the title, nobody shows up. So we would kind of end run and we'd talk about, how many people here are feeling anxiety right now? Just shake it out, take a deep breath, figure out what's going on in your body. And after 8 or 9 of those workshops, one day one of the elders comes walking in with his little notebook and he says, we're all trying to figure it out. I said, what? We're trying to figure out what the experiment is. I was like, no. Once you think it's an experiment, you'll act differently and the experiment is over. And he was like, oh no, I feel like I broke it. I was like, no, you didn't. So we had to start calling them healing workshops, awareness about trauma and those kinds of things. So here I just said, hey, let's just have a genealogy workshop and call it what it is. And that morning, we set up all the tables, and lo and behold, so I got a picture of it here. I left one of the pictures out. So it's this beautiful round building where we put everything people would need for their genograms, their family trees, and we got them all in there, and it was an amazing experience. I can tell you right now that my cousin Samantha was the one who demanded a change be made about the relationship between her mother and her father and the nature of her mother's death. And she was told no. This is our family tree. And not only is Samantha being a part, she's working with our aunt, who was removed from our community when she was 13 and only recently came home after like 65 years. And they're looking at it together. And this post-it note is an emergent property. It's a meta node. Someone came up and said, hey, my family remembered that there's an Indian name from our community that means so-and-so, and it was this person who's on your family tree, and we want you to have it so you can make sure that that's added to your network. That was not the kind of thing our community was very good about doing. That was really difficult for us to do for a long time. So this to me was like a positive thing that happens when we start integrating some of the aspects of our family, our genetics, the way we are rooted, literally rooted to the ground, rooted to our place on the planet, with contemporary notions of Western genealogical research. Nobody dispossessed us of our data. Nobody told us how we had to use it. What we were doing here was getting people pulling together in the same direction. Not being threatened, not that knee-jerk reaction, cultural chip on our shoulder, not that anxiety-driven collective trauma response. But this now is just people working together on good stuff the way that any group on the planet should be able to do it. This is that old school network with the new red lines in there. Great tools that we can use. Because if you would have asked someone, draw me a family tree, our community members would they'd break down a little bit. We had a couple of individuals get up and say, here's my family tree, and I want you to see the way that I encoded all of the trauma that I've been through. And they went through and there were different symbols, including ones for military service, including ones for addiction, including ones for being disconnected and reconnecting. We had another woman that got up and said, it's important for me to talk to you about my family because my daughter has a condition known as XP, which means she is kind of deathly allergic to the sun. And we didn't know that. That happens in about 1 in every 10 million people or something like that. And we've got like 4 cases in our community. We're a really little community. And it's because we were never told who our grandparents were. We were never told how we were related to people because we were told not to talk about it, not to trust, not to build those relationships. But it's absolutely crucial that we do, because we need to make sure that cousins aren't marrying cousins and cousins aren't marrying second cousins and so on and so forth. That's a hard thing to do. That's one of the strongest leaders I've ever seen to get up and say, here's what happened in my community, this is what happened in my family, and I don't want this to continue to happen in our community. And she was picked up, and she was listened to, and she was held, and she helped to recreate entire sections of that network. Afterwards, we interviewed people who usually don't like interviews. Never really does interviews, doesn't like me at all, never talks good about me about anything, doesn't really, these are all people that came in and sat down and said, yeah, there's something important worth talking about here and I want to get it recorded. We're working on a documentary about reconnection, and the nicest thing was at the very end, this woman here who recently has become someone that I work with a lot, she listened to me talk about reconnecting to the community. And when I first came home, I did not have a good reconnection experience. Me linking into my social network was pretty horrific. And this was the 27th year anniversary within a week of 27 years of me coming home. And at the end of the interview, Gina says, oh, I have one more thing to say. I didn't know you back then, and I didn't get a chance to give you a hug and tell you welcome home, but I'm really glad that you came home. Still emotional for me to talk about. Because I came home and the first person I talked to, the only person that I knew that was my education coordinator when I introduced myself, said, I'm on holidays, I'm not taking appointments, and just walked away. Oh, you want to break someone off who doesn't know their family and know anything about their family? We are kind of closing some of those gaps. So this is problem solving when we have a flood of information. If you study information theory, where everyone just throws out, everyone represents their family or their group, and you just throw things out. That doesn't really work for us. I've talked about the circle. We do this thing called ukaneshwitiasha. Literally, uke means one, ishui is heart, asha is the pluralizer. It means it's a group. It's a detached third-person pronoun. We have a representative. You bring that information to them, and what they do is they go around that circle. We still sit in a circle when we pray at this flag. There's only a couple of rules. You can choose to answer or not, but if you do answer, you do not ever get to tell anyone they're wrong, they don't belong, or they shouldn't be there. What this is a crowdsourcing platform for each of these representatives to share what's been shared with them in a problem-solving setting. And you're probably asking, well, no one gets to be told. I like the way you said that, because that's the same way that it was in my family. This is what's in common. Oh, that's interesting. My family did it different from yours, and here's what we can learn from that. And pretty soon, this person's question goes all the way around, and we've identified the optimal set, the optimal domain. Here's all the strategies to help you doing what you're doing. And we've filtered out some of those ones that don't really work. And you know that there's representatives from all of our communities, all of our families here. We do this still all the time. This is how we relate to external researchers now. If you show up and you say, I'm in charge, I know what's going on, you're pretty well laughed out of the room. But if you say, hey, who from your community can we work with? And we usually find someone who's been to school for what you want to know. And we invite them to be a part of that council. And then we solve problems with them. So this group doesn't have the chip on their shoulder from having an external expert. They give us a good question, and this person sends it around, and then it goes around the circle, and we get those ideas, and then it gets sent back. And we do this as many times as we need for these people to be comfortable inviting those external researchers in. This is how all of our health policy research fellowships came about. This is why we're now closing out nearly $2 million of health policy funding at a time when it's increasingly hard to get. Because not only do we do that in the kind of academic sense, and we do that by having our physical meetings, but we also bring our federal researchers with us out onto the land to dig Bitterroot, to see what happens when we bring our kids out when we're digging root. So you can see them literally like the Coyote Roadrunner cartoons, running up the road, kicking up the dust. You want to know what a community looks like when it lives and not just one that's dead and antiquated in a book? This is it. And the only way to do it is to come out and sit with us, with our elders, federal researcher, go through this process and see what it looks like. And then, of course, you get to see us teaching our kids. One of my former students here, one of my former students who's now a language teacher in our community, all these kids learning firsthand from people 100 years ago. They would have been told, you never listen to them. They're only going to lead you astray. They're going to go to hell. You follow them and you're going to die. Those are the kinds of things our kids were taught for 3 or 4 generations. Here we are undoing that, not because we have rewritten health policy according to our own little cultural values. We are doing peer-reviewed research with competitive funding, but we're also able to say there's this other way of rewriting some of those things that don't work for us to include contemporary strategies that do. I've been a part of a lot of health policy reviews, and I don't ever see people going out and doing stuff, getting your hands, we have a phrase in our language that means getting your hands dirty, and literally peeling root and doing that here. It's one of our elders here teaching the kids about the heart of the root and how you bury it, so we make sure that we don't over-harvest. They're talked about, we don't come to the same spot every year, it's different every year. They're talked to about leadership structures because there's one woman in the community that's the chief of the Bitterroot. And she spends the month looking at all the different picking places and then identifies and then tells the people, this is where we're going and when and how we're going to do it. And then here's my social media post. You gotta get the picture. This is the old Dairy Gold ice cream bucket from the 70s that are getting increasingly hard to find. If you ever find those in a pawn shop or something, you should send them to me because the old ladies love them. But this is the peeled root that they worked with the kids for hours and hours and hours. And here's my hand, you can see my rings on there. There's 3 generations, all 4 of our communities, men, women, trauma carriers, healers, researchers. A couple of our federal researchers are in here with us. This is what it looks like. And this picture almost overnight was shared by the public health officer for the province of British Columbia. It became a picture associated with the BC Reconciliation Awards. It became the cover of several of our statistical analyses and reports. And here we are having the dinner. We're actually eating that root, right? It's not just enough that we dig it and you see it. We've got to have that meal. So some of our researchers from Interior Health, and we invited all of our chiefs and councils so that we could give them the findings of our report to them first and to Interior Health. And then they would go from there back to our funders. And here we are all eating. There's me in my pink shirt. My daughter got me that shirt, and then she gets mad whenever I wear it on pictures. My dad was in this picture somewhere, but I think he got cropped out. But here's our stew and our fried bread, which is traditional, but super unhealthy and not really traditional, but you gotta have it in our communities. And then this right here, here's Gina, right? Here's the woman that invited, welcomed me back. Here she is getting herself Bitterroot. We also had kids, teenagers, who don't ever do anything, came and set everything up, and then they delivered all the excess food to the programs that we use to feed the people that don't have enough food to eat. So it's a very kind of holistic way to look at it. And I want to close with a couple of ideas, because I'm not, what time am I completely done here? Like 2 minutes from now or something?
You just keep going, you're good.
Don't tell me that or I'll really keep going.
Still have 20 minutes.
Okay. Oh, 20 minutes? Okay, good. I'll slow down there. So you'll notice I changed over from Kanaka Nation Council to the Lower Kootenai Band. These are band members from Lower Kootenai Band. Their reserve is immediately up to the international border between Canada and the United States. Their community members have served on both sides of the border. And here is I was going to do the redaction, whatever, and they'll see this and they'll know who they are. But it's a little bit anonymized here. But what I wanted to show was a family with veterans that have not just opinions about healthcare and VA healthcare in Canada and the US, but they're also educated and they're involved in governance and research. One having a degree in education, who has now served in the middle of the 4th term as chief in his community, and his daughter, who is a distinguished combat veteran, who now is a registered nurse working on VA services in the Seattle area. And I was lucky enough to be a part of both of these people going away to serve and them coming back and being a part of that network that picks up and holds our returning veterans. This is not just one of those fun pictures. This is one of those things that we saw this family not just maintaining its identity, but rebuilding itself going through this process. And I asked them I asked 3 or 4 people for some block quotes to kind of contextualize what we're talking about here in veterans healthcare. And these were one from each of them. The demands of service stretched and tested the limits of servicemen and women. Sadly, in some cases, exceeding the limits has caused a backlog in VA claims. We served, we're injured, we wait for a ruling on our injuries. I sit and have been waiting for 16 years on the verdict, yet I feel the pain from my service related to trauma every day. We wait. There's no other choice but to wait. Hurry up and wait, right? We all know that one. That's my brother here, the chief of the Lower Kootenai Band. I'm his right hand, one of our kind of traditional leadership models. Work with him on a lot of things. And then my niece said, I asked, what do you think needs to happen? And she says, seek and hire more people of color, especially doctors and nurses, include holistic healthcare practices and policy changes. Put another way, include holistic healthcare when researching for evidence-based practices to improve quality of care for all patients. This makes it possible to build partnerships with community leaders, especially Indigenous nations. And what she's saying here, I think most important, if you are open to a more holistic approach, then you are working, if you are working with people from another community, from another culture, from another group, then if it is holistic, then you have opened the door for some of those valid processes to come through and be a part of the overall discussion. Neither one of these people is saying, you got to give us money to do what we want. They're both saying there's a process. We need support going through that process. And if we can have this idea at the end of that tunnel, that light, if we see there's somewhere that we're going, we can figure out how to arrange resources to make sure that we get there. I can tell you right now, when I had to do my VA appeal, my lawyer decided he didn't want to drive from Spokane to Seattle. You're probably going to lose anyway, so I'm not going to go. And I was like, dude, you get like 20% of my claim. What do you mean you're not going to go? So I went and I represented myself. No support from anyone. When I went through my process, we weren't doing a lot of these things yet. I represented myself and I won. I was like, wow, I should just tell people I'm a lawyer. I won 100% of my cases. One and done, right? I did one and it went pretty well. Things are pretty different now. We know what support looks like. Here is our sweat house. We went through this process where our ceremonies were disrespected to the point where we started building houses around our sweat houses so people couldn't see what we were doing. So one of the things about our community that's kind of quirky is our sweat house is actually in another house, so people can't really see or whatever. And we know now that we don't need to do that, and no one is spying on us anymore, but it's one of those traditions. And I can tell you, there's a nice wood stove in here as well, so when it's like minus 20 out, because it gets cold here, we get to sit inside in that circle and solve problems as a group. And someone that's convened that meeting, asked for us to be there, that's putting up a little feast and feeding everyone, gets to say, here's the problem that I'm having. And then we go around and we listen to each person's suggestions, and no one is told they don't need to be there or that they don't belong. No one's overruled. Everyone's ideas are considered, and at the end of that, we consider ourselves to have the best domain of information, optimal domain of information. And this is a part of the process where we were going through with one of our individuals nearing kind of the end of that disability process. And we start here and we figure out how we're going to do that and bring people back in. And here we have our community veterans, including law enforcement, because in our community, law enforcement and military are kind of looked at as being really one and the same. And so this was a number of individuals that got together to support the individual going through that process. I've kind of cartoonized, colorized them, so you can't really tell who's really on here. Just don't look too close or you'll realize that that's me. There's, I think I skipped a picture. Oh yeah, okay. So this is that person coming back to be whole again in the community, and we just went and stole a horse. Yeah, my name's Horse Thief, and we do still do that. I can tell you that the horse's name is Jack, and he was a very good sport, and Jack was compensated with many biscuits and ended up being very friendly to us. And I do have some really cool high-speed NVG footage where we shot it at night and night shot, but I did have that one. This was the best one that we could get. But we talked about how do we recreate that? How do we have those activities so that the other part, the non-clinical part, the non-hurry up and wait part, the non-formulary part, what does our community do? Well, 100 years ago when someone came back from so-and-so, we do something like this. What would that look like today? Well, today, this is what it looks like. And then we come back into our roundhouse, and I apologize, I wish I had a better picture of the roundhouse because it's really an amazing facility. And so, when we see that things like that work, we tend to get a lot of support. This is this community's new administration center, which is their health facility. And they decided, what's more healthy than putting governance right in the middle of our health resources? So now this is now their administration building. This is where they now have a full-time community health nurse, which this little city that's closest to them has trouble getting healthcare providers to move there, because it's in the middle of nowhere, no one wants to be there. They were able to bring in a full-time nurse, and coming up in the next year, they should have a physician 1 or 2 days a week. That's a pretty big deal for our communities. People don't really do that. Part of the reason is because gathering data here and doing analysis and making a meaningful change means that you have more resources than just a formulary, than just a schematic and a blueprint and a budget and a set of expectations and operational procedures. There's a little bit of a willingness of the community to do things differently, incorporate more ideas, have more one-on-one interactions. I can tell you that the last time we went to the Split House, we brought out some of those healthcare providers because we want them to know when someone from our community says they're taking it to the old man, they're not going to see their grandfather, they're going to see old man's Split House. You need to know those kinds of things, because if you don't, it's kind of like a mystery, you know, kind of like integration by parts. You like mathematics, but you don't really like integration by parts. It's a little bit of mystery as soon as you miss one component of the process. This is a different thing for us. This building also, this is our canoe. That's our sturgeon nose canoe. That's that outline. When you get here, you know this is the lower Kootenai Band of the Ktunaxa Nation, because this is where the sturgeon nose canoe comes from. This is the council chambers. It's set up like a lodge. Because when people made important governance decisions 100 years ago, 200 years ago, 1,000 years ago, 13,000 years ago, there was a big lodge where everyone got together. And these were and it's a little bit hard to see, but all of their COVID panels are in here. This is their health building. You gotta walk the walk and talk the talk. You can't say it's a health building and then not have people wearing masks or being knowledgeable about these things. This is the windows on the far side. This is what they look out over the flats, which is the wetlands, which is the traditional ecological environment that their knowledge is tied to. It's a daily reminder. When we make decisions in this building, we're looking at the flats and we're seeing the kinds of animals, the kinds of considerations we have for our resources and our long-term decisions. And then this is I think it's a feather. They wouldn't really say if it was or not, but this is the opening at the top and what it looks like kind of along this building going back. Our roundhouse is built to look like one of our large ceremonial settings. It's got an amazing kitchen because in our governance structures, there are women that are in charge of the food. The veterans serve the food as an act of service. And when you come back and you're trying to figure out who you are and what disability is and what ability is, we say, hey, when you're here praying with us, helping the community to solve problems the way that we've done since the beginning of time, you have a role here. You'll get your hands dirty. You'll line up with the other veterans. You'll serve the community by giving them food. You'll take direction from the women that are the chief of the food, and you will put the food, literally, the plates onto people's laps so they can eat. And we will sing for you, and then you will do your job here just like you did when you were overseas, just like you did when you were on post, just like when you were in a submarine. Our little community in Canada, we got an award from the Queen like 10 years ago because our community served as something like 13 times the general population during the world wars. It's another part of the reason that the men weren't in a lot of those pictures. Many of those men who came home could not sing, they could not dance, they could not play those roles anymore because they were given no support. In fact, my uncle, who was a World War II vet, who was shot in the foot landing at Juno Beach on D-Day, was told when he came home, you can't be a part of the VFW because you're Indian. He was a strong man. I sat and I interviewed him before I went into the military many times. And I remember he was telling this story and he got to that and he just broke down crying. And, he just said, I laid in a ditch bleeding for 2 days. And I was told I couldn't even go in and have a cup of coffee. So what do? When I went in, we had what we call the old school war dance when a veteran is getting ready to go. And who did I have there as my crier and as my advisor? I brought my uncle. And we did the old school canvas dance, and we did those things that we don't see anymore. They went away with our Sundance, but when we do these with our veterans, we still do them. And we brought some of them in. They had been told, you don't count, you're not a part. In Canada, when you served in the military, you gave up your status, you were no longer considered a Native person. That was a long legal battle for him to even be considered a part of our community again. From the American side, my relatives came up. I had a feast on the American side with my mother's family doing the same thing. Anyone that served in our community, come and be a part of this feast. We're going to do something a little bit different. We're going to move away from the enlistment, MEPS, training, AIT, whatever, getting hurt, come home, hurry up and wait, feel broken, not know what to do, have a breakdown, have another breakdown, be told to hurry up and wait, have another breakdown, and then eventually get some kind of services. We wanted to change all of that. Not just for me, not for my brother, not for my niece, but for people like my uncle who were not given that opportunity, given the hegemonic and what I would say would be colonizing structures. So, just to close up, I'm not saying there should be special rules for every little group, but when it comes to healing, if you're not open to those holistic considerations and some of the details and the context and the nuance, then you're shearing away some of the most important resources. Because for as good as VA healthcare is, I never went into the VA and heard anyone talk about the old school canvas dance. And I never heard anyone there want to know how I rectified over time the relationship with my grandfather that I never met. And I never had any of that kind of stuff.
But now, by incorporating these ideas, having them be together, part of an all-inclusive and culturally informed, trauma-informed practice, we have some of those resources. So that's what I have for you today. I want to thank you again for listening to me. And I think this is a nice presentation to lead in to your next session. Again, thank you.